Hello everyone. So in the last video, we solved immediate food delivery 2, which was question 21st of our SQL 50 series. So today we are going to solve gameplay analysis 4 and which will be 22nd question in this series. So let's dive in. Okay. So we are given an activity table which has 4 columns: player ID, device ID, event date and games played, where the player ID and event date is the primary key combination of columns with unique values of this table. Now this table shows the activity of player of some games. Each row is record of a player who logged in and played a number of games, possibly 0, before logging out on some day using some devices. So there is a player ID and that player plays games on some device with device ID on a particular date, that is event date. And on that date, the games played can be 0 or some positive integer. Now we have to write a solution to report the fraction of player that logged in again on the day after the day they first logged in, rounded to 2 decimal places. In other words, you need to count the number of players that logged in for at least 2 consecutive days starting from their first login date. Then divide the number by total number of players. The result format is in the following example. So let's see an example to understand the question properly. So we are given player IDs, device ID, event dates and game played. So I said that the player ID and event date is a primary key, which means these combination of these two columns will be unique. So player ID and event date. So you see player ID 1 and 1 and these event dates are different. So player 1 on date 0301 played 5 games and the same player played 6 games on date 2 of the same month. So here we can see that the first login of the player was on date 1st of the same month, same year. And on the next day, the player logged in again and played 6 games. For the player 2, he never played again since there is only single entry, player with ID 3. So the player 3 first logged in on 2016, month 3 and date 2 and played 0 games. And the next login of the player 3 was on 2018. So which means that the player 3 didn't log in consecutively of 2 days. So player 1 is the only player which logged in consecutively for 2 days. So the fraction will be 1 by 3 since player 1 is the only player who logged in consecutively for 2 days and there are total of 3 players, player with ID 1, 2 and 3. So the fraction will be 0.33 and it is also mentioned we have to round to 2 decimal places. That's why it is 0.33. Okay. So how should we approach this problem? So if you have seen the last videos which we have solved, so the logic of solving the problem is similar to what we have done in the previous problem. So first we have to create a temporary table that will store the first login of the players and then we'll join both the tables and see if the will match the both the tables using the player IDs and then we'll see if the date difference between the next day and the first login is 1, and if it is, then the player is obviously logged in for at least 2 consecutive days, and that's the entry what we want. So if you want to give it a chance by your own, then try it yourself and pause the video for some time. Okay, so let me write the query to understand it better. So first, as I said, we have to create a temporary table, so with query, but let's just write the query itself so that we can execute it and see the result. So first we'll select something from activity table, and when we select something from this table, what we want is the first login date. So for example, this is the player 1. He first logged in on this date and then logged again on this date. So this says that we have to, it is also not mentioned that the event date is ordered from lowest to the highest. Let me see if it is mentioned or not. Okay. Okay, it doesn't matter by the way. So this is the player, and the player first logged in on this date and then again on this date. So what we want is the first login date, that is this date. For the player 2, since it is single entry, this is the first login date. For the player 3, this will be the first login date. So since the player 1 has multiple entries and there can be multiple entries, so we want only the first login date. Okay, so we have to group by player id, and in doing so we can get the first login date. And what will it be? It will be minimum of event date. Okay, and we will have to select player id as well. Okay, from activity table. Now let's see the result. Okay, so you see the player 1 logged first time on 2016-0301, that is this date. Player 2 on 2017-0625, and player 3 on 2016-0302, and that's the correct information. Let's just rename the column to event date itself. Okay, now we'll store this as a temporary query in a temporary table. So with let's give this as first login date as this. Okay, now what we want is we have to like join these two tables, first login table and activity table. But how should we join? For example, this is our first login table, and if we join this with the activity table on a condition that player id on this table is equal to player id on that table. So let me do to this only. So select star from, and we'll join first login table, join activity table on condition that player id on this table is equal to player id on activity table. So first let's see the result of this query. Okay, so this is the result of the query where the player id on the left table is equal to player id on the right table. Okay, but what's given in the question? We want to report the fraction of player that logged in again on the day after the day they first logged in. So this table contains the first login date. So if we join this table with this table, what we want is, since this table contains first login date, we want that the second login date on this table difference with first login date equal to 1. Okay, so this is the first login date and this is the second login date, and the difference of these two dates should be 1. And if that difference is 1, then we know that the player has logged in for consecutive of 2 days. So let's see an example. So these are the two entries for the player id 1. The player first logged in on, these two will be same, these two will be same as these are coming from the first login date. So first login date for the both the entries will be same, and the second login will be on the same date, which is wrong. Second login is on 0302 and difference is 1. So this entry is the correct entry. Okay, for the player 2 this entry is again wrong. For the player 3 the entry is again wrong. For the player 3 again this entry is wrong. So there is only a single entry that will give us the correct result. Okay, so the next condition is, and the date difference of the next date, that is the next date will be activity dot event date, and the first login date will be dot activity date, sorry, event date. Okay, then we'll get a single entry. Okay, so we'll get a single entry, that is player with id 1 is the only player that logged in consecutively for 2 days. His first login was on this date and the next login was on this date. Okay, now what we want to select. Okay, this is the resulting table. So what we want to select is, first we'll round the result to 2 decimal places, and in that we'll use count star, which will give us 1. Then we'll divide the result by total players, which will select from select count of every entry from first login date. So first login date will contain first login for each player, which means each player. So the total will give the total number of players. So we want to return this as fraction. So let's see if the result is correct or not. Count star from first login date. Okay, so it will be select. Okay, so our solution got accepted. Now let's submit this to see if all the test cases are passed or not. Okay, so all the test case has been passed. Okay, so our this solution is accepted, but now there is an improvement in this solution. Can you think of? So you see, we have used the select query inside the select. So can you try to remove this? If you have solved all the problems, you will be able to come to this optimized solution. So let's see the change that we can make to remove this select query. So we have used this condition that the player ID on both the table should match. Okay, that's okay. But by adding this AND condition that the date difference should be 1, we got the result that gave only single entry, right? So let me show you again. So if I remove everything, that is everything, and run the query again, you see, I got the single entry. But what if I remove this AND line and run it again? So this is the entry that we got here. Okay. Now we can improve or remove that select query. See, what we want is the entries in which second day login date minus first login date is equal to 1. That's what we want. So we can use sum where sum of all those entries where the date difference of activity.event date and first login date.event date is 1. So this will give either true or false. For each entry, this will give, for this entry, it will give false, true, false, false, false. So the total will be 1. Okay. Now we have to remove this select query. So we remove this. Instead, what we write is count of distinct what player IDs. But player ID we have in the both the tables. So player ID in the first table and player ID in the second table. We have two player IDs. So we can select either of them. So let's say we'll select from first login date. Okay. And now we run the same solution again for the test cases. And our solution is again accepted. Now we'll submit it to see the final result. Okay. So our solution got accepted. So let me walk you through the solution again. So what we did is first we have created a temporary table which has information about each player and their first login date. Okay. And using this information, we joined activity table with the first login date. And in doing so, we did it by condition that the player ID on both the tables should be same. So what should we select from these join resulting table? We want to select the sum of all the entries where the next day event date to the previous day event date, the difference is 1, which gives us the result that the user or the player has logged in consecutively for at least 2 days. Okay. Then we want to divide it by total number of players. So, which is the distinct of all the player IDs give us the total number of players and we round it to the 2 decimal places and return it as a fraction column. That's it.